What is the legal definition of torture? If a measure does not cause vital organ failure and/or death, it is not torture. That was the guidance that had come from the Department of Justice. The United States has offered incentives financially and diplomatically and defense and so on and so forth to states that are willing to reach peace with Israel. The issue has always been the fundamental objective of the United States is to guarantee, protect the continued existence of Israel, of the Israeli people. I was one of the few who knew what we were doing. And so it was my duty as a CIA officer and as a citizen to try to say no. A steady loss of support in the United States for Israel because the narrative is essentially being defined as a powerful army causing suffering to 2 million Palestinians. The US is no longer the hegemon, and that changes the way the world will function. As China grows in global power and influence, China's influence in the Middle East is increasing. We see this now in any number of ways. I am from Boston, Massachusetts originally. I was the fourth generation of my family to live in the same house and grow up there. And that's in part what pushed me, I guess, to a career in international affairs. I went into the CIA, where I served for my whole career. I wanted to choose the most challenging, hardest profession I could find. When the attack of 9/11 occurred in September 11, 2001, CIA redirected many of its resources towards counterterrorism, what came to be called by the Bush administration the War on Terror, which is a terrible name, but that's what the name was. So about a year after the attack of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, I was asked to be involved in the interrogation of an individual we thought, my institution thought, was one of the very top members of Al-Qaeda, who could lead us to Osama bin Laden, and even if he couldn't, as having enough information that would probably enable us to destroy Al-Qaeda. So that was an extremely high priority and objective for the United States and for the CIA. But I came to feel that we had misunderstood who this person was. This person was taken off a street in the Middle East in the belief that he was one of the top few members of Al-Qaeda. But it's very hard as an individual officer to challenge an entire institution. You have to win over the institution, your peers, and your superiors progressively, and so to be taken seriously. So I tried to do that. When I was first briefed about the operation I was going to be involved in, appalled at the instructions I'd received and the measures that I was told we could use. My boss came back to my office, something he never did. He said, listen, I need you to go on a temporary duty assignment overseas. You need to leave within 24 hours. You may not tell any of your colleagues where you're going or what you're doing. You may not tell your family. It's important for the CIA, and it is important for your country. Will you do it? So I went to the counterterrorism center immediately, and we were both standing in a hallway. And then he poked me in the chest as he spoke. And he said, you will do whatever it takes to get this man to talk. Do you understand? And I physically recoiled. And I said, we don't do that. And he said, well, we do now. And I thought, oh my God. I immediately thought, whatever it takes implies torture to me. At least the president would have to, he'd have to order that. And he said, we have it. We have authorization. That was an allusion I learned later to what came to be called the torture memo. And a direct order from the president is a process in the CIA, in the intelligence world. It's called a finding. That I, the president, this is the wording used, I, the president of the United States, find that such and such is in the national interest to perform, and I so order it. Signed the president, the attorney general, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and so on. Which means that the Department of Justice, in this instance, had approved its legality. I didn't, frankly, this is absolutely true at the moment. At that moment, I didn't care that the president had authorized this. The president, to me, and to any officer, does not get to authorize something that is illegal. And so I said, well, suppose something happens I consider inappropriate, wrong. So he looked at me with disdain. He said, well, if something happens you don't like, walk out of the room. And if you don't see something happen, it didn't happen then, did it? And I thought, oh my God. I then said something that field officers like me don't normally deal with. It's the lawyers who should deal with these issues before they get to us. And I said, well, what about the Geneva Convention? Which the United States wrote the text of the Geneva Convention, which of course outlaws torture. And what about the United States Constitution and the Uniform Code of Military Justice and CIA regulations? And he then looked at me with real disdain and he said, well, which flag do you serve? Immediately after that briefing, I did something I just about never do, really. I immediately went to find one of the CIA lawyers. And CIA officers, of course, try to avoid the lawyers because they always say, no, you can't do things, which is their job. So I found one of the lawyers, someone I'd worked with and respected, and I said, okay, what is the legal definition of torture? He said, if a measure does not cause vital organ failure and or death, it is not torture. But that was the guidance that had come from the Department of Justice. Now, when you say the Department of Justice, it came from a political appointee of the Bush administration who was a neoconservative and who essentially wrote guidance to enable the White House to order whatever it wanted in this instance, which is just shocking. That's not legal, that's garbage. Well, what will I do? What am I to do? What am I going to do? I wanted to find bin Laden, but I wouldn't torture someone. I wouldn't break the law. I didn't care what the president had ordered. When I became involved in the interrogation, I would not do anything physical to the guy, I just wouldn't. But I, of course, am only one officer in a vast institution, and so I could protect him, frankly, or could control matters as I described it to him within this bubble. But the bubble was under pressure, and the more he and I displeased my masters, the smaller the bubble became and the more likely I would be taken away. So I tried to convince the institution about that. But my time ended and I was replaced. And I was not able to convince the institution. So at the time I felt, whoa, I'm pretty isolated here. And that was wrong, which is a heartening discovery. Because when you read the Senate torture report, you will find that a large number of my colleagues felt the same way I did and struggled in more or less the same ways I was to oppose this. But we failed. I wrote my book, The Interrogator, because during my career as an intelligence officer, the job is to obtain secret information about other countries or societies or organizations or individuals that is relevant to the national security interests of the United States. So that's fine. I've seen something that I believe, I've been involved in something that I don't just believe, I know undermined the principles, the practices, the laws, and the culture and the institutions of the United States. And if I don't somehow try to oppose such a fundamentally wrong act and process, then I become complicit. I was one of the few who knew what we were doing. And so it was my duty as a CIA officer and as a citizen to try to say no. You know, I wrote my book and then I had to submit it to the CIA, to the Publications Review Board for review. I wrote my book to be about 100,000 words, and the CIA censored 40,000 of them. And so I engaged in what amounted to a year or 18-month process of trying to push back and challenge them on why they had censored one passage or another. And I had been careful not to reveal sources and methods. And that became an arduous process, so that when one reads my book, one can see the passages that were deleted because they're marked in black. It was pretty clear to me that the CIA as an institution, and in particular the people who had served in the Bush administration, the neoconservatives, didn't want me to publish the book, because who wants to say that the CIA and the United States had tortured? You know, torture is a crime. Much worse than that was people who, acting on behalf of the former government officials, contacted publishers and producers for various news programs to say off the record, we'll just give you a heads up about this fellow, Glenn Carl. You might hear about him in a book he's written. And then they said, well, you know, I was a discredited officer, a malcontent, looking for a job, out to make a buck. I had only very peripheral involvement, and I had made a lot of most everything I had made up. They denigrated really awfully my family members and how I couldn't manage my family, and so how could I manage an operation if I couldn't manage my family? But the book came out. But that was a big part of the process, yes. I think the conclusion that I tried to convey is that the harm we did by this error has harmed the United States, I think, more than any other harmful consequence. You know, we did wrong to an individual, but we undermined who we are in a lasting way. And I can document, I can substantiate that. Prior to the attack of 9/11, September 11, 2001, polls showed that a strong majority of Americans believed that torture was unacceptable, un-American, illegal, and that the government institutions existed to protect us from that sort of wrong. After 9/11 and the, quote, war on terror, unquote, a majority of Americans, in particular Americans under age 35, believe that guys like me, the CIA, the US government, can torture. They support that as necessary for the national defense. So we have become something different than we were, than the ideals that I took an oath, and my colleagues took an oath very sincerely, to preserve, protect, and defend. The enhanced interrogation program. And this was created after September 11, 2001, for the following reason. The U.S. invaded Afghanistan to try to destroy al-Qaeda and seize bin Laden. When that happened, then the United States quickly found itself in the possession of numbers of individuals who were made prisoners. In addition to that, there were a small number, I don't know the number, but it was small, a couple of dozen people, I don't know, who were rendered, as I described, who were seized by a covert operation because they were assessed to be senior members of al-Qaeda or someone planning a terrorist operation, something like that. And the reason the term rendered is used, very carefully, because the objective of this operation is if someone has either committed or is planning an act that kills people or causes destruction, and that individual or those individuals are beyond the reach of any law, then what do? You either do nothing and they will blow up another bus or whatever it is they're planning, or they will get away with having done so. But if you can seize them, you can render them, which means hand them over to the United States judicial system for prosecution. It transmuted after 9/11 into seizing and holding, which raises all sorts of legal problems because, of course, you can't legally hold someone without charging someone. And it was clearly an aberration, obviously, to American ideals, American laws, and practice. It is simply not true. The impact is catastrophic. Catastrophic. And what are the consequences? Now, the enhanced interrogation program is not the only reason the United States is so divided today, and you have one of the two major candidates for president, someone who was president, advocating torture again and flouting the laws and arguing that the laws shouldn't apply, the Constitution shouldn't apply, that it's necessary to be a dictator on day one, that it's the institutions of the United States government are the enemy of the people, which is a profoundly fascist concept. So it has been catastrophic. This is why I say it has caused the United States far more harm than any benefit. Tragically, during the, quote, war on terror, the proponents of the framework of the war on terror viewed pretty much any Muslim grievance and violence as part of the global war on terror and the jihadist conspiracy. And all of that is, frankly, if not nonsense, profoundly wrong. But that view has been largely, repudiated since the Bush administration left office in 2008. Even, I would argue, the Trump administration, because it was staffed by a number of neoconservative Republicans also, continued to believe that, but the policies were happily not as simple-minded as during the Bush administration. So today, certainly under the Biden administration and under the Obama administration, under every administration since 9/11, well, other than the Bush administration and Trump, which really means the Republican Party, the neoconservatives, does not conflate the Gaza issue or the Iranian issue with, quote, the war on terror. So no, it's different. The U.S. Viewpoint and objectives in the Middle East have been very consistent from really since World War II, but certainly since 1967 and 73, which is that war is not a solution, injustice to any people or nationality or religion is unacceptable, that the only solution to the clash between Muslims and Jews, Arabs and Israelis, is a two-state solution. So therefore an independent Palestinian state and an Israel, that the Palestinians in particular now and before then Muslims and Arabs in general needed to accept the legitimate existence and independence of Israel, and that Israel must accept the legitimacy and the reality creation of a Palestinian state. The United States has offered incentives financially and diplomatically and defense and so on and so forth to states that are willing to reach peace with Israel and vice versa. The United States were to pressure Israel to oblige it to change its policies. One, it probably could not. It literally could not. You could stop all aid and all weapons deliveries, and that would most likely strengthen the vehemence and probably the control or influence of the far right in Israel. But that's the lever that the United States has. Were the United States to do that, because the U.S. doesn't just act magisterially by itself, it has to deal with its own internal contradictions. And no government, this is something all of us forget when we look at other governments, no government is a monolith or acts in a vacuum. And U.S. leaders of whatever political persuasion have to find a way that they can keep their governing coalition in office. And were the United States to repudiate essentially Israelis' defense and say, do this or we don't care what happens, the government would not be able to stay in office any more than the opposite direction of supporting Israeli I don't know, conquest of all of the Middle East. I mean, I'm thinking of something absurd. The issue has always been the fundamental objective of the United States is to guarantee, protect the continued existence of Israel, of the Israeli people. But that Israel progressively doesn't represent the Western interests or the U.S. interests in the Middle East, as the U.S. has, as primarily the Middle East has itself evolved from allies, perhaps, of the Soviet Union. Cold War has ended, the Soviet Union doesn't exist, and as those states have become legitimately more sovereign and capable themselves, more moderate in their own policies internally and internationally, Israel representing the vital interests of the U.S. is as true today as it was under the Bush administration, because it was a neoconservative one, or in 1968. I think that what's happening in Gaza has been a catastrophe for pretty much everyone, with the possible exception, at present, of the far right of Israel. Who's a winner? Hamas thought that it was being very astute by its being the Hamas's attack on October 7. I think the main objective of that attack was to show we Palestinians cannot be ignored. You will not destroy us by ignoring us, and this is our one chance to remain or put ourselves back into relevance, because otherwise history will move on and the Middle East will even more forget us and ignore us. Already it's clear that long-term that probably will be a failure. It's been a failure too because although I think most people have felt that militarily it would really not be possible to utterly destroy Hamas. Hamas has been terribly hurt at the cost of even greater pain and suffering and destruction to the 1.95 million Palestinians who are not members of Hamas. Although the view in the Middle East is that the U.S. is unconditionally supporting Israel in this, a steady loss of support in the United States for Israel because the narrative is essentially being defined as a powerful army causing suffering to 2 million Palestinians. Western view is, look, Israel has a strong army and is rich. The Palestinians are locked into a very small place, have no power, and are mistreated. That view has been strengthened by a year of invasion and I guess 40,000 deaths of Palestinians. 40,000 deaths is hideous. A massacre implies, however, the intentional killing of innocents. And if that is the case, then anyone who does that should be condemned morally and formally and legally. The far right of Israel probably does seek to expel all Palestinians from Gaza, like all Palestinians from the West Bank. I think that is true, but that's a small faction of the Israelis, happily, although disproportionately influential. Well, the U.S. is no longer the only kid on the block, or the only person with a bat in his hand. China is a global power, and for the first time in China's history, is projecting its power beyond China's borders. That is a world historical event, and that changes the way the world will function. The U.S. is no longer the hegemon. It is a great power with other great powers. It has one relative peer power, not quite yet, but closer every day, and that is China. But economically, there are four, the United States, the European Union, China, and Japan. There will soon be five, to include India. There will be three great powers politically, the United States, China, and India, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So how does that affect the United States? It's a multipolar world de facto. The question is, will it be a multipolar world that embraces a normative international system of rules-based conflict resolution on the whole, or will it be a sphere of influence, might makes right system of bilateral deals where one is the major power largely setting the terms and the others may benefit in certain defined ways through bilateral agreements, which is what China is seeking, and to some extent what Russia is seeking too. So it's a dramatically different world today than 15 years ago. There have been two schools of thought in the United States on how to respond to China's rise. The first has been to facilitate China's rise in the hope and the belief that China would integrate into the normative system, and then as a global power it would have increasing influence, a function of its economic and political and military power. The other school of thought has been China's rise is a threat to American leadership and is an existential challenge, threat, and must be stopped. And once again, that has been the view of the neoconservatives. You can wish whatever you want, but the reality is that nothing is going to stop China's rise. So really the first option is the only realistic one, unless one's willing to accept the real risks of a superpower war, frankly. As China grows in global power and influence, China's influence in the Middle East is increasing. We see this now in any number of ways. China has a base, military base now in Djibouti. It seems all great powers like to go to Djibouti. They have become more involved in seeking to maintain the flow of shipping on sea lanes up to and including in the Middle East. They are more interested in trade deals than before and securing energy supplies, which is critical for China, not just China, but certainly for China. So their interest in the Middle East and their influence in the Middle East is increasing and will continue to increase, certainly. Certainly.